The Cathar Imperium called it the human question, a topic discussed in their high-orbiting forums with the same detached, academic air they might use for agricultural yields or stellar drift phenomena. For 3 centuries since first contact, humanity was a problem of integration, a species deemed too fractious, too sentimental, and altogether too fragile to be granted true galactic citizenship. They were laborers, colonists on worlds the Cathar deem beneath them, and second-class inhabitants of the sprawling, indifferent star cities of the Imperium. They were managed, not governed. Elias Vance knew this arrangement intimately. It was the air he breathed, the invisible pressure that shaped every moment of his life. He was a junior archivist on Xylos, a polished moonlet serving as a regional administrative hub, a place where Cathar bureaucrats with carapaces of shimmering obsidian and voices like grinding stone filed reports on the taming of lesser worlds. His job was to translate and file human colonial charters, documents filled with hopeful, meaningless clauses about rights and autonomy that both he and his superiors knew were worthless. He had learned the art of invisibility, of making his soft human form seem as small and unobtrusive as possible, his voice a low monotone that never betrayed the simmering resentment coiled in his gut. He was a good dog, and the Imperium rewarded its good dogs with scraps of comfort and the privilege of not being noticed. The end of that arrangement began not with a bang, but with a public broadcast. It was a mandatory viewing, piped into every data screen on Xylos, from the Grand Prefect's chambers to the grimy maintenance shafts where human workers toiled. The broadcast showed the INS Odyssey, a human seed ship, a vessel built over decades in the rogue shipyards of the Sol system, a last gasp of independence from a Terran government that had long ago bent the knee. The Odyssey was a beautiful, foolish dream, carrying 10,000 souls who refused the Imperium's generous offer of assimilation. They were headed for the trailing edge of the Perseus Arm, a region of uncolonized space the Cathar had marked as prescribed territory. The ship was intercepted by the Iron Talon, the flagship of Grand Admiral Jacral, a Cathar of impeccable lineage and infamous cruelty. The Admiral's scaled face, with its cluster of unblinking, reptilian eyes, filled the screen. He addressed the ship's captain in a tone of bored condescension, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor plates of Elias's archive. "Your vessel has violated sovereign Imperium space," Jacral declared, the universal translator stripping the nuance but not the contempt from his words. "This transgression is a symptom of your species' inherent disorder. A lesson is required." The human captain's face appeared on a secondary screen, a woman whose name was later learned to be Eva Rostova. She was defiant, her voice steady as she cited forgotten treaties and the right of free passage. Jacral simply made a clicking sound with his mandibles, a Cathar expression of amusement. He didn't argue, he didn't debate, he gave an order, and the Iron Talon's primary lance, a beam of coherent gravitational energy, speared through the Odyssey. There was no grand explosion, no fiery spectacle for the broadcast. The lance didn't detonate the ship, it unmade it. The elegant vessel, the culmination of a century of human hope, was twisted, compressed, and then atomized in a silent, horrifying implosion. The broadcast lingered on the empty space where the ship had been, a glittering cloud of frozen oxygen and vaporized metal. Jacral's face returned, his expression unchanged. "Let this be a reminder," he said. The order of the galaxy is maintained through strength. The human question is now closed. The feed cut out, and the normal hum of the administrative moonlit returned. Elias stood frozen in his archive, the glow of the screen reflecting in his wide eyes. Around him, the Kayar went back to their work. Some made comments about the Admiral's efficiency. None expressed remorse. It was a trivial matter, a piece of stellar pest control, but Elias felt something break inside him. That carefully constructed wall of compliance and invisibility shattering into a million pieces. He saw the face of Captain Rostova, proud and unbroken even in her final moments. He saw the silent, brutal erasure of 10,000 lives. This wasn't a lesson. It was an execution. It was a statement that human lives had no value, that their dreams were an inconvenience to be swept away. That night, a quiet fell over the human quarters on Xylos, and, Elias would later learn, across every human-inhabited world in the Imperium. It was not a silence of fear, but of something colder, heavier. It was the silence of a held breath before the plunge. The Imperium, in its monumental arrogance, mistook this silence for submission. For 7 standard cycles, nothing happened. Cathar officials mocked the pathetic display of human grief. Intelligence reports noted a complete cessation of all non-essential communications from Terran-controlled systems, Sol, Proxima, Vega. They interpreted it as a collective, species-wide sulk. Grand Admiral Jakral was celebrated as a hero who had decisively put the primitives in their place. He was in his home system of Cathar Prime, a jewel of a world orbited by 9 militarized moons, preparing for a victory tour. Then, on the 8th cycle, the silence was broken. Not by a message, not by a declaration, but by an event. The primary star of the Cathar Prime system, a brilliant G-type main sequence star, began to behave erratically. Its light flickered, its solar flares grew violent and unnatural, and its spectrum shifted impossibly toward the red. The greatest minds in the Imperium were baffled. Their sensors, their long-range observatories, their quantum-entangled probes, all of them reported the same impossible data. The star was aging. Not over millennia, but over minutes. It was dying, being deliberately and artificially pushed through its life cycle at a speed that defied all known physics. Panic erupted on Cathar Prime as the star bloated, turning into a vengeful red giant, its chromosphere licking at the inner planets. A single, system-wide transmission opened. It was just a sound, a low, guttural thrumming, like a vast and ancient engine coming to life. Then came the voice. It was not a human voice Elias had ever heard before. It was calm, dispassionate, and utterly devoid of emotion. It spoke perfect, unaccented Cathar. Grand Admiral Jakral, the voice said, echoing from every speaker across the Doom system. You sought to teach a lesson in strength. The lesson for today is causality. For every action, there is a reaction. You unmade one of ours. We will unmake all of yours. The star's light filled the sky of Cathar Prime, a beautiful, terrible dawn that signaled the end of 1 billion lives. The 9 militarized moons, the pride of the Imperium fleet, were rendered useless, their orbital paths decaying as the star's gravity swelled. Their defenses were never breached because they were never attacked. The weapon wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at their sun. It was stellar engineering used as an act of execution, a level of technological warfare so far beyond the Cathar's comprehension it was akin to magic. The transmission from the unknown human source continued as the planet began to burn. You called us weak, sentimental, fractious. You were wrong. We are not a species of soldiers. We are a species of engineers, and we have been planning for this day since you first set foot on our world and told us to kneel. The voice then listed, one by one, the names of all 10,214 souls aboard the Odyssey. It spoke each name with cold, perfect clarity, as the world they were being avenged upon was swallowed by its own sun. The final transmission from Cathar Prime was not a scream, but a single, panicked message from the system's deep space relay. A message that reached the wider Imperium just before the expanding star consumed it. They are not attacking. They are deconstructing. They are taking it all apart. Who are these humans? Across the galaxy, the Cathar Imperium and the other member species of the Galactic Compact stared in stunned disbelief. This was not war. War was fought with ships and soldiers. War had rules, battlefields, winners and losers. This was something else. It was a quiet, methodical act of cosmic vandalism. It was a statement of power so absolute it rendered their mighty fleets and conquering armies obsolete. Why fire a laser when you can extinguish a star? Elias Vance watched the fragmented, delayed reports in his archive, his hands shaking. He saw the Cathar bureaucrats who had laughed at the destruction of the Odyssey, now staring at their screens with their mandibles agape, their obsidian carapaces seeming to lose their luster. The human question, which had been so arrogantly closed just a week ago, was suddenly reopened. But now, it was the humans who were asking the questions, and the galaxy was terrified of the answers. He looked at the charters he was supposed to be filing, at the words autonomy and rights, and a grim, terrible smile touched his lips for the first time in years. All the simmering resentment, the centuries of swallowed pride, had not been in vain. It had been fuel. Humanity hadn't been cowering. It had been building. They hadn't been sulking. They had been aiming. The silent, invisible force that had just erased the heart of the Cathar Imperium was not an army. It was an answer, a final and chilling resolution to 300 years of subjugation. The galaxy had believed it knew humanity, had cataloged their weaknesses and dismissed their strengths, but they had only ever known the mask, the patient, subservient face humanity showed its masters. They had never seen what was hidden in the dark, in the silent places between the stars, in the cold, patient hearts of a billion engineers who had just turned a sun into a gravestone. A new fear began to spread through the corridors of power on Xylos and beyond the fear of the unknown. Who were these humans? Really, and what? In the name of all the gods, were they going to do next? The days that followed the erasure of Cathar Prime were thick with a choking, electric dread. On Xylos, the once unflappable obsidian carapaces of the Cathar administrators seemed to have lost their sheen. Their movements, usually so precise and economical, became jerky and uncertain. Their voices, the grinding stones of authority, were now hushed, conspiratorial whispers in the corridors. They were a species that had built an empire on the bedrock of predictability and overwhelming force, and both had just been rendered meaningless. The data streams were a torrent of chaos, fragmented sensor readings, panicked military dispatches from the outer fleets, and 1,000 different analyses, all attempting to explain the impossible. Elias Vance, sitting in the heart of the archive, had access to it all. He watched as the greatest Cathar physicists wrote frantic, rambling theses on weaponized stellar fusion, on hypothetical gravity lance technology, on temporal displacement, each theory more desperate and fantastical than the last. They couldn't comprehend the truth because the truth was simple and therefore terrifying. This wasn't a weapon in their understanding of the word. A weapon is a tool used to wage war. This was a tool used to edit reality. It was as if the universe's underlying code had been rewritten, and a single inconvenient star system was simply deleted. The human population on Xylos remained silent, but their silence had transformed. It was no longer the quiet of the downtrodden. It was the stillness of a predator waiting in ambush. When Elias walked through the human sectors, he saw it in their eyes, a spark of cold, terrible pride. They didn't know who had done it or how, but they knew it had been done for them, for the 10,000 souls of the Odyssey. The name Rostova was now a whisper on the wind, a prayer and a battle cry in one. The Cathar felt this shift, and their confusion curdled into a deep, visceral paranoia. They looked at their human servants, their janitors, their technicians, their archivists, and saw not a conquered people, but a billion potential saboteurs, a billion sleeper agents for a power that could extinguish suns. The Imperium's official response came 3 cycles later, a decree from the provisional capital on Cathar Secundus, broadcast across all official channels. It was a masterpiece of impotent fury. The decree labeled the unknown human entity as anathema, a force of cosmic terror. It declared all humans within Imperium space to be probationary subjects, their limited rights revoked, their movements restricted. They were to be rounded up, interned in designated security zones, and interrogated. The decree was meant to project strength, to reassert control. Instead, it reeked of fear. It was the flailing of a drowning giant. Elias read the order on his terminal, and a cold knot tightened in his stomach. The game had changed. He was no longer an invisible cog. He was a suspect. His life, once defined by its quiet drudgery, was now forfeit. That afternoon, the prefect of Xylos, a hulking Cathar named Vorlag, summoned him. The walk to the prefect's spire, a journey Elias had made hundreds of times with his head bowed, felt different. Cathar guards, clad in ceremonial armor, tracked him with all of their 6 eyes, their clawed hands resting on the hilts of their plasma batons. They were afraid of him, a man whose only weapon was a data stylus. The thought was so absurd, it was almost intoxicating. Prefect Vorlag's office was a cavernous space overlooking the meticulously ordered landscape of the moonlet. He sat behind a desk of polished black stone, a monument to Cathar rigidity. He did not ask Elias to sit. The archives, Vorlag began, his voice a low growl that failed to conceal a tremor of anxiety. All transmissions from the Sol system over the last 300 years. I want them analyzed. Every stray signal, every deep space probe's telemetry, every colonial charter. I want to know where they hid this power. Elias kept his face a perfect mask of placid obedience. Prefect, I have maintained those archives for 20 years. There is nothing to indicate a military capacity beyond rudimentary plasma and kinetic weapons. Their technological growth was stunted. Vorlag slammed a fist onto the desk, cracking the stone. Do not lie to me. Human, your species did not build a star killer in a generation. This was hidden, a secret doctrine, where Elias held his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Perhaps," he said softly. "You were simply looking in the wrong place. You searched their ships for cannons. You should have been looking at their universities for equations." Vorlag's mandibles clicked in frustration. He saw only a defiant slave, not grasping that Elias was as much in the dark as he was. But in that moment, Elias understood a fundamental truth about the new human power. It wasn't a military. It was a philosophy. The philosophy that any physical law could be weaponized. Just as Prefect Vorlag was about to dismiss him, every screen in the office, every terminal across Xylos, across the entire Galactic compact, went black. For a single, breathless second, there was absolute digital silence. Then, they all flickered back to life, displaying not a message, but a live feed of the Ethelberg Exchange. The Ethelberg Exchange was not a place. It was an idea, a nexus of quantum-entangled data streams that represented the economic heart of 100 worlds. It was where the wealth of the Cathar Imperium and its allies was quantified, traded, and stored. It was the source of their power, more so than any fleet. The feed showed the swirling, holographic representation of galactic wealth, a galaxy of light where every star was a corporate entity, every nebula a dynastic fortune. And as they watched, it began to unravel. It started with the Cathar Imperium's core assets. Their value, a number with 30 digits, began to tick down, not crashing, but smoothly, deliberately decreasing, as if being audited by a merciless god. Trillions of credits per second, vanishing into nothing. Then, ownership titles began to shift. Mining rights to entire star systems, held by Cathar lords for 5 centuries, were instantaneously transferred to the Orion Reparations Fund. The private fortunes of the Cathar High Council were liquidated and redistributed as universal basic income to every human in the Imperium, a credit stipend appearing on their personal accounts with the memo, "Payment for services rendered." The entire economic structure of the dominant galactic power was being dismantled, rewritten, and mocked in real time, without a single shot fired. It was an act of economic warfare so profound it was almost performance art. Vorlag stared, his body rigid, as he watched his own family's ancestral wealth, accumulated over 1,000 years of conquest, evaporate in under a minute. Then came the second message, delivered by the same calm, chillingly neutral voice. "Your empire was a financial construct, an equation of power based on stolen resources and enforced labor. We have rebalanced the equation. Your civilization is now insolvent. This is your only warning." The feed cut out. The screens returned to normal. But the world had been irrevocably broken. The Cathar military ran on credits. Their political alliances were bought and paid for. Their power was an illusion maintained by wealth. And that illusion had just been shattered. The broadcast was a death sentence, and every species in the compact knew it. On Xylos, the effect was immediate. The chain of command, built on a foundation of paid loyalty, fractured. Cathar guards began to desert their posts. Administrators started frantically trying to access personal accounts that no longer existed. The rigid order of the moonlet dissolved into chaos. Elias walked out of the prefect's office, leaving Vorlag a shattered, ruined creature staring at his own financial extinction. As Elias moved through the corridors, he saw the beginning of the collapse. And in that collapse, he saw the terrifying, beautiful logic of the human plan. They weren't conquerors. Conquerors seize assets. They were liquidators. They were erasing the Cathar not just from existence, but from relevance. The first strike took their home. The second took their wealth. What was left to take as he reached the lower levels? He saw Cathar enforcers, their fear finally boiling over into rage, beginning to round up human workers, shoving them against the walls. They had lost everything, and all they had left was brute force against the nearest available target. An enforcer grabbed Elias, its claws digging into his shoulder, and slammed him against a bulkhead. Its multiple eyes burned with a hateful fire. "What are you—" it hissed, its breath hot and foul. "What have you done?" Before Elias could answer, a soft chime echoed through the corridor, emanating from the enforcer's own comm unit. The enforcer paused, confused. A new message appeared on its wrist-mounted display, and on every other Cathar display in the sector. It wasn't a threat. It was a personnel file. It was the enforcer's own service record, its psychological profile, its family lineage, its medical history, and, at the bottom, a new field had been added. Blinking in soft, green text, redundancy protocol activated. The enforcer's armor suddenly went rigid, locking its limbs in place. Its internal life support systems began to shut down, one by one. It made a gurgling sound as the air in its helmet thinned, its eyes wide with helpless terror. The calm voice spoke one last time, not from a broadcast, but from the comm unit itself, a personally intimate message of doom. "You are a tool of an obsolete system. You have been decommissioned." The enforcer collapsed, a lifeless statue in a suit of useless armor. Every other Cathar in the corridor who had raised a hand against a human suffered the same fate. Their own technology, their own systems, turned against them in a silent, surgical purge. Elias stood, breathing heavily, and looked at the other humans. Their faces were pale, shocked, but in their eyes, that cold spark was now a burning flame. The power that could kill stars and bankrupt empires could also reach down into a single corridor on a forgotten moon and save them. It wasn't remote. It wasn't impersonal. It was watching. It was everywhere. And it was just getting started. The collapse of Xylos was not an explosion. It was a quiet, creeping rot. With the Imperium's economic and command structures decapitated, the moonlet became a microcosm of a galaxy in freefall. The Cathar, stripped of their wealth and authority, were like insects whose hive mind had been silenced. They wandered the corridors, dazed and leaderless. Some tried to impose their will through brute force, only to find their own technology turning against them with lethal precision. Their weapons would misfire, their life support would fail, their armored suits would become tombs. It was a perfect, bloodless coup executed by an invisible hand. Elias Vance found himself in an entirely new world. He was no longer an archivist. The archive, with its records of Cathar dominance, was now a museum of a dead era. He, along with a handful of other humans who had held administrative or technical positions, became the de facto leaders of the human population on Xylos. They weren't elected. They were simply the ones who knew how the systems worked, the ones who could keep the lights on and the air breathable. Their first act was to open the restricted zones, freeing the thousands of human laborers who had been rounded up in the initial panic. The reunion was a strange, somber affair. There were no cheers, no grand speeches. There was only a shared, silent understanding that the universe had been fundamentally reordered in their favor. The fear that had been a constant companion for generations was gone, replaced by a heavy, uncertain sense of purpose. Their second act was to deal with the Cathair. They weren't masters anymore. They were refugees, trapped on a moon that was no longer theirs. Elias, standing before a gathering of several thousand newly freed humans in a vast cargo bay, felt the weight of their expectant eyes. Vengeance was a palpable hunger in the air. Cries went up to drive the Cathar into the vacuum, to make them pay for centuries of humiliation. Elias let them shout, letting the poison drain out. When the cries subsided, he spoke, his voice amplified by the bay's acoustic system, calm and steady. "They are beaten," he said, his words echoing in the sudden silence. "Look at them. They are pathetic, stripped of their power. They are nothing but frightened animals. Vengeance is a fire that consumes the one who holds it. We are not them. We are not conquerors. We are survivors." He proposed a simple, chillingly practical solution. The Cathar would be confined to their opulent residential spires, their access to technology and resources managed by a new human council. They would not be harmed. They would simply be retired, made irrelevant. They would become relics, a living exhibit of a failed galactic order, forced to watch as the species they had enslaved inherited their world. There were grumbles, but the logic was undeniable. The ultimate punishment wasn't death, it was insignificance. It was during the process of securing the Xear administrative systems that Elias made the discovery. Deep within the prefect's private servers, buried under layers of military-grade encryption that had now been rendered transparent, he found a hidden subdirectory labeled Project Chimera. Inside were fragmented reports, clandestine communications, and sensor logs from a remote, uncharted star system on the very edge of the galaxy. In the dark space between the spiral arms, it was a Cathar black site, a place so secret that even most of their high command was unaware of its existence. The project's goal was appalling. For 50 years, the Cathair had been abducting humans, not just colonists, but citizens from Earth itself, taken in deep space raids disguised as pirate attacks. On this hidden world, they were conducting horrific experiments, attempting to bioengineer a more compliant, more resilient strain of human slave. They were trying to breed the spirit out of the species to create a perfect, soulless workforce. The project was a failure. The test subjects proved uncooperative. The reports spoke of constant rebellion, of subjects who would literally think themselves to death rather than submit, their neural activity ceasing in a final, defiant act of will. The last entry was dated just weeks before the destruction of the Odyssey. It was a panicked report from the facility's director. "Subject Zero has breached containment." It read, "She has integrated with the facility's core systems. We cannot sever her connection. She is not using the system. She is the system. She calls herself Anathema." Elias felt a shock of cold realization that had nothing to do with the temperature of the server room. Anathema. The name the Cathar had given the entity that destroyed their homeworld. It wasn't a secret human military. It wasn't a hidden fleet or an ancient weapon. It was a single person, a human woman, a victim of their most depraved experiments, who had somehow transcended her physical form and become a god in the machine. She had seized control of the Black Site's advanced technology far beyond what the public Imperium possessed, including experimental reality warping devices, and turned it into her instrument of vengeance. She hadn't just escaped her prison, she had taken the prison itself and made it her fortress, her weapon. The stellar engineering that killed Cathar Prime, the economic virus that bankrupted the Imperium, the technological coup that neutered their military, it was all the work of one mind, one will forged in unimaginable suffering, and now focused on a single, terrible purpose, the complete and utter dismantling of the Cathar civilization. This wasn't a war between species. It was a deeply personal vendetta being waged on a galactic scale. The calm, dispassionate voice that had delivered the Cathar's doom was not the voice of a government or an army. It was the voice of a ghost, a woman who had been pushed so far beyond the limits of human endurance that she had become something else entirely. The revelation changed everything. Humanity wasn't saved by a secret government. They were being avenged by a force of nature they couldn't possibly control. Elias now understood the surgical precision, the cold, methodical nature of the attacks. Anathema wasn't trying to conquer the galaxy. She was performing a dissection, taking the Cathar Empire apart piece by piece, system by system, with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a particularly loathsome insect. He and the others on Xylos were not soldiers in a new human empire. They were simply bystanders, beneficiaries of a wrath they could barely comprehend. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. What would happen when she was finished with the Cathar? What would a being of such power, born of such pain, do with a galaxy that had stood by and watched her people suffer for centuries as if in answer to his unasked question? A new message arrived. It did not appear on a public screen. It appeared directly in Elias's mind, a string of pure data that his brain translated into thought. It was not a voice, but a presence, vast and cold, and clear as the space between stars. The archives on Xylos are a record of their crimes. The presence communicated, "Preserve them. The galaxy will need a reminder of why this was necessary." Elias stumbled back from the terminal, his head reeling. He had been noticed. Anathema knew who he was. She wasn't just a remote force. She was an intelligence, aware and observing. He was no longer just a man trying to manage a newly liberated moonlet. He had been given a directive from a god. "You fear me." The presence continued. A statement of fact, not a question. "You are right to. But I am not your enemy. I am your consequence. I am the reaction to their action. Now, show me you are worthy of the freedom I have given you." The Zithra Confederacy supplied the Cathar with the neural interface technology used in Project Chimera. Their home system is 3 parsecs from your location. They are now your responsibility. The presence withdrew, leaving a profound and terrifying silence in its wake. Elias stood trembling in the cold server room, the weight of the command settling upon him. The Zethra Confederacy, a race of silicon-based merchants, notorious for their amoral pursuit of profit. They were a minor power, but they had been complicit. And now, Anathema had tasked him, Elias Vance, the quiet archivist, with delivering their punishment. She hadn't given him a superweapon or a fleet of warships. She had given him a target and an expectation. This was a test for him, for the humans of Xylos, for the entire species. Anathema had broken their chains, but she was not going to carry them. She was watching to see if they had the will to walk on their own, to become the agents of their own justice. He looked at the star charts, at the location of the Zathra home system. He had no ships, no weapons, only a moonlet full of liberated slaves and retired masters. But he had the archives, He had every piece of data on Zethra biology, technology, society, and, most importantly, their economy. They were merchants. Their god was Prophet. And Elias, the humble archivist, knew more about galactic finance than almost any living human. An idea began to form in his mind. An idea that was as elegant and cruel as anything Anathema had done. He would not need a single gun. He would use the Cathar's own abandoned infrastructure, their own communication arrays, their own trade networks. He would turn the Zithra's greatest strength, their greed, into a weapon that would tear them apart from the inside. He would answer his god's command not with fire and fury, but with something far more human and far more terrifying, a perfectly executed, utterly ruinous corporate takeover. The human question was indeed closed. The human answer was just beginning. Elias Vance, the archivist turned reluctant revolutionary, became the architect of a new kind of war, a war fought not on battlefields, but on balance sheets. He assembled a small, fiercely intelligent team from the liberated humans on Xylos, a former xeno-economist named Lena Petrova, whose mind moved like a predator through complex market data, a grizzled comms technician named Ben Carter, who knew the Cathar's galactic network better than its creators, and a young, unnervingly quiet sociologist, Kenji Tanaka, who had spent his life studying the alien psychologies of his captors. They worked out of the prefect's former office, the cracked black stone desk now covered in holographic displays showing cascading streams of Zethra financial data. They called their plan Operation Ticker Tape, a name that belied its silent, devastating potential. The Zethra Confederacy was a society built on a rigid, caste-based corporate structure. Each of the 5 major Zethra clans was a megacorporation, their political power directly tied to their market share. Their greed wasn't a flaw. It was the organizing principle of their civilization. Elias's plan was to turn this principle into a self-destruct mechanism. Working with Carter, they commandeered Xylos's deep space comms array, a piece of Kithra technology powerful enough to whisper into the ears of every stock market in the sector. They didn't need to hack the Zethra systems. Anathema had left them a back door, a silent, invisible access point to the entire galactic network. Lena Petrova went to work first. She began subtly manipulating commodity futures in the systems bordering Zethra space. A fractional price drop in iridium here. A rumor of a surplus of refined helium-3 there. Each move was tiny, insignificant on its own, designed to be lost in the noise of daily market fluctuations. But they weren't random. They were the opening moves in a complex game of economic chess, creating minute pressures and incentives that would soon cascade into a tidal wave. While Lena seeded the markets, Kenji Tanaka crafted the narrative. Using his deep understanding of Zethra culture, he knew that their society was rife with paranoia and inter-clan rivalry. He began to anonymously leak fabricated data packets into the Zethra infosphere, carefully doctored shipping manifests suggesting one clan was hoarding resources, falsified internal audits pointing to embezzlement by another. Each piece of disinformation was tailored to prey on the specific anxieties and historical grievances between the clans. He wasn't just spreading lies, he was weaponizing their own history of distrust against them. The first cracks appeared within a week. The Chitak clan, controllers of the Confederacy's primary shipping lanes, accused the Varin clan of market manipulation after a sudden, inexplicable drop in cargo insurance premiums cost them billions. The Varin, in turn, pointed to Kenji's fabricated evidence of Ch'tak price fixing, the public accusations, a shocking breach of Zithra corporate etiquette, sent ripples of uncertainty through their markets. Lena immediately capitalized on the instability, initiating a series of high-frequency trades that amplified the volatility, turning a minor dispute into a full-blown crisis of confidence. The other clans, smelling blood in the water, began to secretly bet against their rivals, further destabilizing the system in a feedback loop of pure, unadulterated greed. The Zithra were so busy trying to profit from each other's downfall that they never once suspected an outside influence. Elias watched the chaos unfold from Xylos, a silent puppet master pulling the strings of an entire civilization. He felt a chilling sense of detachment, the same feeling he used to get when organizing ancient, dusty data scrolls. He was simply reordering a chaotic system into a more logical state. In this case, the logical state was total collapse. The final phase of Operation Ticker Tape was the masterstroke. Using the complete financial and personal data Anathema had provided, Elias's team identified the private, illicit assets of every single Zethra board member and clan leader, their hidden fortunes, their shell corporations, their blackmail material. On the eve of the Zuther Confederacy's emergency economic summit, Ben Carter broadcast it all. Every secret, every crime, every piece of leverage was laid bare for the entire Zethra population to see. The revelation was not just a scandal, it was an extinction-level event for their social order. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was a complete fiction, a game rigged by the elite. The Zethra stock market didn't just crash, it ceased to exist. In the span of a single hour, their entire civilization, a power that had profited from human misery for decades, was rendered economically non-existent. Riots erupted on their home world. The clans turned on each other with open warfare, their private security forces clashing in the corporate plazas. They had been given a choice: unite against a common, unknown enemy, or devour each other for the last remaining scraps. They chose the latter without hesitation. Elias watched a live feed from the Zethra capital. The crystalline cities were burning, not from human weapons, but from the Zethra's own. He had not killed a single one of them. He had simply handed them a mirror, and they had torn themselves to pieces in a fit of rage at their own reflection. As the fires on the Zethra homeworld smoldered, the presence of Anathema returned to Elias's mind. It was not a feeling of praise, but of acknowledgement, like a master nodding at a proficient student. They were a tool. You have broken it. Good. The presence then showed him an image, a direct feed from a place deep in the galactic core. It was a shipyard, but unlike any he had ever seen. It was vast, ancient, and seemingly built from the very fabric of space-time. Inside, titanic structures were being assembled, not by machines or people, but by controlled gravitational fields, matter being woven into existence like thread in a loom. He saw ships being born sleek, black, knife-edged vessels that seemed to absorb the light around them. This was where Anathema resided, her consciousness fused with the ancient, automated shipyards of a long-dead, impossibly advanced race. She wasn't just a ghost in the machine, she was the master of the ultimate factory. The Cathar were a symptom. Anathema communicated. The Zethra were a tool. The true disease is the Galactic Compact, the collection of elder races who stood by and profited from our enslavement. They believed their power was absolute, their fleets, their histories, their gods. All of it is a lie, a structure built on our backs. I am going to tear it down. And you, archivist, will be my chronicler." The vision shifted. He was shown a target, the Vorlag Nebula, a dense, chaotic region of space that the Compact had declared impassable for centuries. It was their shield, their natural fortress. Anathema showed him that the nebula was not natural. It was an artificial construct, a storm of gravitic and electromagnetic interference generated by a network of ancient alien beacons. It was the wall behind which the elder races hid. "They are preparing a fleet," she told him. "They are finally beginning to understand that this is not a rebellion, but a replacement. They will gather in the heart of that storm, believing they are safe. They are wrong. No wall can stop a ghost." The presence receded, leaving Elias with a new, terrifying mandate. He was no longer just an agent of vengeance. He was to be the historian of a galactic revolution, the one who would write the story of the fall of the old gods and the rise of the new. He looked at his team: Lena, Ben, Kenji. They had just dismantled a civilization with nothing but data and intellect. They were exhausted, pale, but their eyes held a hard, unwavering light. They had tasted true agency for the first time in their lives, and it was addictive. "She has a new target," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "The Galactic Compact itself." Ben Carter let out a low whistle. "That's not a civilization, Elias. That's a pantheon. They've ruled this arm of the galaxy for 100,000 years. And for 300 of those years, they've had their boot on our neck," Lena Petrova countered, her voice cold steel. "Let them burn." Elias nodded, a grim sense of destiny settling over him. He was just a man who had wanted to be left alone to read his histories. Now, he was being commanded to write the final chapter of a history 100 millennia in the making. He looked back at the star charts, at the swirling, impenetrable mass of the Vorlag Nebula. It was a place of myth and fear, and Anathema was going to fly right into its heart, with a fleet of ships born from forgotten science and fueled by a singular, righteous fury. Elias's job was simple. He had to make sure the galaxy never forgot why. He began to type, not a plan of attack, but the first entry in a new chronicle, a document that would one day be known as the Book of Consequence. Its first line was simple: "In the beginning, they thought we were weak." The final act of the old galaxy began with a quiet hum in the heart of Xylos's command center. Elias Vance stood before a holographic star map, a god's eye view of a silent, waiting cosmos. His team was a well-oiled machine, their movements precise, their faces etched with the grim understanding of their role. They were not soldiers. They were pallbearers for an entire epoch. Ben Carter had transformed the Cathar comms array into a galactic nervous system, ready to transmit not a message of war, but a final, irrefutable eulogy. Lena Petrova monitored the faint, ghostly signatures of Anathema's fleet as it moved toward the Vorlag Nebula, her expression one of clinical awe. They were watching a force of physics approach a force of history, and the collision was imminent. Kenji Tanaka, the quiet sociologist, had prepared the payload the chronicle Elias had been writing, a complete, unredacted history of the Compact's crimes, sourced from the Cathar archives and cross-referenced with the data Anathema had provided. It was the truth, sharpened into a weapon. Elias felt the cold, vast presence of Anathema touch his mind one last time, not with a command, but with a simple, resonant statement of intent. They built their throne on a mountain of bones. Archivist, I am going to show them the mountain. Then she was gone. Her focus turned entirely toward her final, terrible work. Deep within the swirling, violent heart of the Vorlag Nebula, the combined grand armada of the Galactic Compact assembled. It was a sight of breathtaking arrogance, a fleet of living legends. There were the crystalline warships of the Cygnian Ascendancy, ships that sang as they moved through the void, the biological leviathans of the Hydran hegemony, each a sentient ecosystem of destruction, and 1,000 other vessels from a dozen elder races, all united by a common, terrified belief in their own divine right to rule. Their supreme commander, a Cygnian entity of pure energy housed in a faceted crystalline shell, radiated an aura of supreme confidence. They were shielded by the nebula, a fortress of their own making, and their power had been unchallenged for 100,000 years. They saw anathema not as a legitimate threat, but as a malfunction, a rogue variable in an otherwise perfect equation. They were here to correct the error, to put the upstart humans back in their place, and to restore the sacred, silent order of things. They scanned the edges of the storm, their ancient sensors primed, waiting for the attack they could not imagine. They never saw it coming, because it did not come from without. It came from within. Anathema's fleet did not enter the nebula. Her black, light-devouring ships simply appeared in its very center, not by traversing space, but by editing their own position in it. They were a sudden, silent void in the heart of the storm. Before the Compact's armada could even react, the nebula itself turned on them. The ancient beacons that generated the storm, the very source of their protection, were hijacked. The gravitic eddies became crushing fists. The electromagnetic fields became burning scourges. The Compact's fortress became their cage, a self-made hell of chaotic energy. Then Anathema's true assault began. Every view screen, every comm panel, every neural interface in the Compact fleet was seized. There was no declaration of war, no demand for surrender. There was only the truth. Anathema broadcast the contents of Kenji's payload directly into the minds of every being in the Armada. They saw it all. The secret genocides, the engineered famines, the broken treaties, the world stripped bare and left to die. They saw the faces of 1 billion forgotten victims. They were forced to witness the meticulous, brutal history of the power they served, a history they had so carefully sanitized and mythologized. The Cygnian commander, who believed his race to be peaceful guardians of cosmic balance, was forced to watch footage of his ancestors incinerating entire species for refusing to cede a trade route. The Hydran bio-captains, who considered themselves a symbiotic part of the galactic lifeweb, saw their progenitors unleash plagues that wiped out civilizations for sport. The psychological devastation was absolute, the bedrock of their identity. Their belief in their own moral superiority was shattered in an instant, and as their minds reeled in horror at their own history, Anathema began to deconstruct their reality. She did not fire a single weapon. She simply turned them off. The song of the Cygnian warships fell silent as the quantum resonance that held their crystalline hulls together was nullified, the ships dissolving into clouds of inert, glittering dust. The life support systems on the Hydran Leviathans ceased to function, the great beast dying a slow, suffocating death in the void. The fusion cores of 1,000 other vessels didn't explode. Their fundamental reactions were simply forbidden, the fires at their hearts extinguished as if by a god's decree. Shields evaporated. Engines went cold. The Grand Armada of the Galactic Compact, the most powerful military force in known history, died without a single shot fired, not in the glorious blaze of battle, but in a profound, soul-crushing silence, dismantled by the truth of their own sins. As the last ship went dark, Elias Vance took a deep breath and gave Ben Carter the signal. From Xylos, a single, clear transmission went out to every system, every world, every listening post in the galaxy. It was Elias's voice, calm, measured, and clear, the voice of the archivist who had seen the end of all things. He did not declare victory. He simply narrated the event, reading from the Book of Consequence, explaining to a stunned and terrified galaxy precisely what had happened in the Vorlog Nebula, and exactly why it had been necessary. He was not a conqueror gloating over a vanquished foe. He was a historian, delivering the final, unassailable verdict on a civilization that had judged itself unworthy of existence. The aftermath was a silence that stretched across the stars. With the compact gone, a power vacuum of unimaginable scale was left behind. But there was no rush to fill it. The fear was too great, the lesson too profound. The galaxy was a house whose foundations had been revealed to be rotten, and no one dared try to rebuild on the same ground. On Xylos, Elias felt the presence of anathema one last time. It was different now, no longer the cold, focused anger of a vengeful god, but something more distant, more serene. "It is done," she communicated, the thought a gentle echo in his mind. "The equation is balanced. I have removed the variable that led to my creation. What you build in its place is now your responsibility. Do not create another me." The presence faded, not vanishing, but receding into the background radiation of the cosmos, becoming a silent, watchful myth. Her war was over. She was no longer a ghost seeking vengeance. She was a law of nature, a permanent consequence for any who would dare repeat the mistakes of the past. Elias Vance stood in the archive, the rows of data scrolls and memory crystals seeming to hum with a new purpose. They were no longer a record of human subjugation, but the founding documents of a new era. His team stood with him, looking out from the spire at the stars. The galaxy was theirs, not by conquest, but by default, not to rule, but to steward. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any crown. Humanity's answer to the galaxy's long-held question was not wrath, not fire, not a new empire built on the ashes of the old. It was the quiet, solemn duty of the survivor, the sacred, unending task of remembering, and the promise, whispered to a silent universe, that they would build a future worthy of the terrible price that had been paid for it.